Hi, I'm Naomi Falk, the editor of Lindsey Webb's Plat, published by Archway Editions in May 2024. And here's an interview between me, Lindsey, and publicist Mia Risher.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this again. This is the second video of our Archway Video Edition series. The first one was with Blake Butler. So I can start off with a similar question that I asked him, which was, like, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? And what were some pivotal moments in your life where you knew you wanted to take writing seriously as a profession?
Yeah, I think that I wanted to be a writer for a really, really long time since I can remember. But the idea of taking it seriously as a profession literally just like did not seem an option to me. I grew up in a really small kind of suburb, and it was very conservative, and I was just not really surrounded by a lot of art. And so it just like, it was sort of always something that I knew I was interested in, that I knew I would do somehow. But yeah, I never really thought that I would feasibly be able to make it a career. And to be clear, I still don't know if that's true because I haven't quite done that yet. And I think especially like as a poet, I think poets in particular have this kind of like, I don't know, I feel like we have this weird relationship to the idea of like writing as a day job because so few of us can make that work. And so I know a lot of poets who have a totally different day job or who are parents or who are whatever. And some do go on to kind of like teach and supplement their income that way. And so I think for me, I still kind of like have that childhood mindset of like, I don't know if this is going to work out, but I'm going to try and push it as far as I can, in the sense that like I'm going to see what I can do, I'm going to see what I can get away with, I'm going to see kind of what's possible for me, and the money making question is less of a priority for me, just because I think that's the kind of reality. If everyone read more poetry, maybe that would be different. But
Right.
yeah.
I feel like it's so difficult with poetry because if you have kind of a different discipline, especially like you're writing journalism or nonfiction, right? It's like your life as a career writer and then your life is like whatever you're doing personally can overlap so much more easily, especially if you're doing reportage. You can get like kind of the bigger book deal, and there's just more continuity between the two things. And I think for poets it's so hard because like how does that configure into the rest of your life? It's like, especially writing kind of more experimental like literary forms already, which is kind of segmented part of like the publishing industry, poetry even more so. And then when you get into the indie publishing houses,
Yeah. I mean, to like, and that, like, to be clear, I don't think that's always a bad thing for literature. I think it's like everyone should be able to kind of like, artists should be able to survive. But I also think like there's something about that mindset of like, I'm gonna do this no matter if it pays me or not, because it's a priority in my life, because there's something important that I feel like I want to do or say or accomplish with it that is meaningful to me and not to a market. I think that's kind of great in some ways, at least for literature. I think it makes for really interesting writing. And yeah, I don't really want to be like beholden to a market. I don't want to feel like I'm constrained in that way. Like I do kind of like think it's important. I guess I kind of have these like idealistic visions of like I can kind of protect this art, in part because nobody else seems to really want that much of it, in terms of a market, and so that kind of creates this little protective bubble of like, this is a place where I can say something that feels true and also try new things without being overly worried about whether I'm in some kind of mainstream or not.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember like the first, like when you started writing poetry, like how old were you, or like the first maybe poem you wrote? Maybe that's a long time ago, but yeah, if you like how you kind of started writing poetry.
Well, it's funny because I actually always like wanted to be a novelist from when I was a kid,
Oh,
and like that was really what I was exposed to, and I think that was like what I thought I would do. And I still have aspirations to write a novel one day, but I didn't really start writing poetry seriously until I was a teenager, and even then, it was like I was writing sad poems about like people I liked or something,
yeah, yeah.
and keeping them secret. Um, but I, um, but I, by the time, so like a sort of funny thing happened where I was in high school during the kind of boom of blogging, and so I had like this ancient now blog spot where, and like all of my friends would have blogs and Tumblrs and stuff, and we would like post our writing online, and it was only for each other, and it was like this funny little kind of like mini community among my friends in high school. And I would post some of my poems online, and I would remember like posting them, and I would go to school, and like my friends would be like, I read that poem, that was really great. And that was like my first feeling of having some kind of literary community. And I remember I was like applying to colleges, and my parents were trying to help me find scholarships, and I remember my mom found one that was a creative writing scholarship, and she was like, I think you should apply. And I was like, no, I'm like embarrassed and whatever. I was like, I don't want to share my stuff. She went onto my blog and copied my poems and submitted them for me. And I was unspeakably pissed at her
Oh
until
yeah.
I got the scholarship. um, and
Right.
one of the conditions of the scholarship, it was kind of an interesting thing where you could get, you got the scholarship, but you had to take a creative writing class sometime during your first year of college, during your freshman year, which is unusual. I think a lot of like, if you're going to take a creative writing class, it's like you wait till kind of closer to the end when it's like an elective and you're done with your generals or whatever. But that was a condition. So I remember I took my first creative writing class ever when I was a freshman in college as a condition of that scholarship. And that was when I was like, oh, I'm surrounded by people who are taking this seriously. I'm like in an environment where people are not only taking their own work seriously, they're taking my work seriously. And that was a total shift for me. And from then on, I was just like, this is something I have to find a place for in my life.
Is your blog still up, or is it still
Oh, I hope
available?
not. Oh my gosh. I should go and find it and delete it before this gets posted.
Do you was there what was the first piece you got published? Was this like after once you were in college, or yeah, when was the first thing you were published
Yeah.
online?
Um, yeah, it was a poem, and it was in college, and it was for the college literary journal. Um,
Oh, cool.
and I had like some friends who were working on the staff, and they were like, you should submit, and I had submitted before and gotten rejected. Um, but yeah, I vividly remember the poem that got accepted. It was a poem about my mom who has some health problems, and about that situation. And it was just this really short poem, and I remember like where I was, like where I was sitting, like the computer I got the email on, and like I just remember completely like feeling like something has changed. Like no one else feels like anything has changed. No one else thinks this is a big deal, but this is like the beginning of something. Whether or not that was actually true, it just felt like so monumental at the
Yeah.
time. And I ended up like joining that literary staff, or the staff of that literary journal, which was its own kind of rewarding experience, probably even more rewarding ultimately than getting that one single poem published that no one remembers. But but yeah, I will always remember that moment probably.
You've had two chapbooks, right?
Hmm.
House and Perfumers Organ. When were those written? And yeah, that was after college, I assume.
Yeah, it's funny. Both of them were written. So after college, I went to get an MFA, and both of them were written after my MFA was over, and they
Oh,
didn't have anything to do with my thesis that I wrote. Um,
What was your
house.
thesis?
What was that?
What was your thesis?
I my thesis was just a collection of poems, a lot about the West, and I don't know if they will ever be published. I don't know how I feel about them. They are currently in cold storage. But I remember finishing my thesis and having a summer off before my partner was set to start his own MFA like across the country. And I would go to the Smith College Library every day and try to write something. And I would just like bang my head against the desk because like I don't know, you finish something that like labor intensive and I don't know, I just felt like I needed like some kind of cleanse. I needed to sort of like start something new, and I just really missed the way I used to write before I was in this like degree program, which felt really playful and really kind of open and experimental. And so I started writing the beginnings of what would become House. And it was just a thought experiment about architecture and like what was possible in language in terms of like creating a physical space or the sense of a physical space in language that couldn't exist in the real world. And that was purely just a kind of thought exercise, and I was doing all kinds of other experiments in that vein, in other directions. And and so that became a longer poem once, and it of course ultimately ended up as one of the sections of Plat, even though it changed a lot from the version I published as a chapbook versus the version that ended up in the full-length book. But yeah, it was like it started out as this very kind of open, loose, very kind of low stakes play, and then it wasn't until I had been working on it for a few months and sort of playing around with it that I was like, something deeper is happening here. I keep wanting to come back to this, and so it's probably not just a fun exercise. It's probably doing something a little bit more important, if I can say that. A little bit more, like it seems like it has more to say, and so that's when I started thinking about my friend who had died the year earlier, and how kind of there was this like presence in all of these poems that felt like it needed to be named, and it was her, and also like some of the ways that I was thinking about space and like sharing space with other people and construction of like experience that architecture that is kind of like how architecture works. That suddenly kind of like I found myself thinking a lot about the afterlife and about death and about how and about sharing that kind of space with someone who had died. So it took a while, I guess, to get there and to become like a full poem in that way. But yeah, so that was the beginning of House, and I sent it to lots of different chapbook publishers, and they were all, not all of them of course, but some of them were very kind, and so it was very like reassuring. And then this great press that specializes in hybrid genre work called Ghost Proposal out of Chicago picked it up, and it was great. And you also asked about my other chapbook, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that one was different because I had already finished Plat. I'd already finished mostly writing it. And this, so it also came out of like, I had just finished something really heavy and kind of hard and time consuming, and I just like really needed a place to play. And I think chapbooks, like in particular, are really good for that, for me. For some reason, they are like less intimidating than trying to write a full book, but there's still a large enough space to play with ideas that maybe don't feel quite as like self-serious as like the stuff that like I might think belongs in a book. And so I don't know, I guess both of my chapbooks tend to be kind of like these more of these playful experiments, or at least they start out that way. And that was how Perfumer's Organ started. It was like I was getting really into perfume, but it was also in the middle of the pandemic, and I was like not able to go into stores to smell perfume because a lot of their perfume counters were closed. And so I was like ordering stuff online and like corresponding with some of my friends online about it. And I started it as a scent journal to kind of help train my nose. And I really liked the idea of writing down descriptions of these perfumes that I was smelling, that I was trying and trying to keep track of. I liked the idea of like someone coming to that document and not knowing what they were referring to, like not understanding that they were perfumes, and having this sort of like surreal kind of multi-sensory experience with that. And so that was really fun for me. And again, it kind of just started out as that on that level, I guess. But again, as I got deeper and as I started thinking about like, well, this is also something I can't really put away for some reason. Like I keep wanting to come back to it. I keep like feeling like there's something else happening here, that I have more to say. Then it started to be about like communication across distances and about like loss and longing, and for I think in a way that a lot of people could relate to during the early days of the pandemic, that kind of like feeling isolated, but also thinking about like both language and perfume as a means of communication, as a means of prayer, as a means of trying to reach someone who is distant from you. And once I kind of arrived there, that's when it felt like, okay, I can turn this into something. And so I sent it to Rob McLennan, who's a critic and publisher and poet himself, who lives in Canada, and he runs this amazing blog and this like whole ecosystem of experimental poetry, and he wanted to publish it. He actually asked me, he had read House, and he asked me if I had anything, if I ever had another chapbook manuscript, if I would send it to him. And so I sent him that. And so that publication process happened really fast.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
I like how, I don't think I'd put it together in my mind that both the chapbooks kind of come together for Plat, House being part of Plat, and then Perfumer's Organ being like not an allegory, the perfume you made to accompany Plat. Like you can kind of see that the evolution come together in this form, which is Plat.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also because the way that obviously Plat was written prior to Perfumer's Organ, but I think looking at your work kind of at large, not just in the poems that are here, but the other poems I've read of yours online, there's this like interest in like an extra sense, not like SCENT, but like SENT, and kind of like this unnameable way that language is so kind of like interchangeable, and like you're saying, like language is play, which I think indicates to this other thing that you can never quite put your finger on, which makes the rain kind of like ghostly and haunting. But it seems consistent with this idea that you have an interest in scent, which is also super underrepresented in writing because it's so hard to capture. But I think you capture it so well in Perfumer's Organ, and also kind of coincidentally in Plat, especially like your use of color and imagery.
Thank you.
It's interesting.
Could you talk a little bit about Plat? I mean, you meant like your writing process and kind of when you were writing it, and then I think the concept of Plat of Zion and how that like comes into Plat, maybe other writers you were influenced from when writing, or other concepts you were influenced by when writing Plat, kind of, giving some context.
I think similarly, I'm not a very I hesitate to say this, but it's also true. I just am not a very disciplined writer. I'm not one of those people who sort of starts a project and like methodically kind of chips away at it until it's done. I really have to feel like I'm like I can't put it down, like I have to go back. I have to feel some kind of pull toward it, and that was ultimately what happened with the beginnings of Plat as a project, where I had finished House, the chapbook, and I was kind of sending out a cobbled version of like House plus parts of my MFA thesis as like a full manuscript out to various contests, and I never really felt that great about it. I was just like, whatever, these are just the poems I've written. I'll just like put them in a box and send them places. And of course that wasn't really working because I didn't really believe in it as a unit. So why would anyone else? But I kept going back to House and like writing. And I was like, this is not smart because this has already been published. Like, why are you adding more? And of course, like I just realized after a while that that for better or worse, this was going to be a really important part of whatever I did next. And so I ended up kind of reworking a lot of House, and I had an idea as well to think about doing something similar, but in relation to, rather than architecture this time, in relation to like the natural world. And so that's kind of where Garden began and it was written explicitly as a companion piece to House, because again, I felt like this might be a better kind of way to, I just had more to say about both of these things, and it needed that extra space. And of course I was also thinking, at the time it did not have the title Plat, but I was thinking about the relationship between architecture and gardens, and ultimately thinking about sort of that in religious terms, and not just in terms of symbolism, but also in terms of like, I was like, by that point I was far away from Salt Lake, which is where I grew up, and I was thinking a lot about it, and I was trying to kind of think about the problem of sort of where I came from, which is not necessarily a problem, but it was interesting, I guess, to think about it as a problem, in that like I just had a lot of questions about like the way that space is kind of used here in the West, and the way that it's particularly used in the particular context of Mormonism. And so that of course brought me to the Plat of Zion, which is a vision that Joseph Smith said that he had of a kind of idealized, an ideal city that kind of operates according to eternal laws, non-earthly structures. And it looks like a giant grid, and basically in the center there are houses of worship and community centers, and around it are sort of places for people to live, and in a ring, but also a grid, in a gridded ring. And then around that there is space for like agriculture. And that's not a super unfamiliar idea in American kind of urban planning. The Jeffersonian grid is also a pretty similar idea. But the difference was this was sort of, there's no commerce here in that place. There's no capitalism as we would recognize it built into that. It's specifically designed for a kind of communal living where the countryside can kind of feed the center, and that this can then be like sort of replicated, perhaps indefinitely. And so this kind of model, this like gridded model, was never kind of like explicit, never like perfectly developed anywhere, but it was pretty much anywhere that Mormons ended up settling, it was sort of partially introduced or partially developed. So a lot of cities throughout the West, and even in the Midwest, where Mormons lived, you can see those kinds of grids much more like firmly defined, and it's ultimately because of this Plat of Zion. So that kind of balance or tension between the country and the city, between like what was ultimately kind of in practice, ultimately a colonialist sort of tool for expansion or a vision for expansion, but also a non-capitalist, a kind of communal living kind of vision. All of those tensions were really interesting to me, and the way that they have been sort of planted in the soil, so to speak, here in Salt Lake City. If you've ever been here, the grid is very much a part of the way you experience the city. All of those were really interesting to me. So that was kind of ultimately where Plat became a useful figure to kind of articulate some of those tensions that I was thinking about very kind of on like a macro level of like how do these kinds of, how do the way that we see structures, not only of our physical material structures, but also our structures of belief, our structures of gender, our structures of power, and our kind of less structured relationships of like family and friendship, how do they kind of influence my own way of being in the world? And that was kind of ultimately the thing that helped me organize all of those things into a book.
Did you study architecture at all in either of your programs, or is it just an interest that you developed? Because I know you're like well versed in speaking about architecture, and also the book is research. Like I feel like people don't really think of poetry as being like a research-based project, or not necessarily other poets, but people in general. I'm curious where this interest came from. Architecture is so, I think, difficult for people to approach.
Yeah, it was not, I didn't study it formally. And so in some ways I do feel like if anyone is actually an expert in architecture, they would have a lot more to say about it than I do. But it was something I'm interested in. And I do feel like I have this habit of like looking to other disciplines for like lexicons, for interesting words. And so like the project I'm working on right now is a lot about mining, and I have zero formal background in anything related to mining, but in some ways I feel like that frees me up a little bit to kind of borrow some of that language. Same thing with perfume. I'm not a perfumer. I didn't study it. I didn't study chemistry. I did in high school, but I got a horrible grade. Like I'm not good at it, but there's something about the language of perfumers, or that kind of like lexicon, that was really that's freeing for me to borrow from, even though I have to acknowledge that I'm not an expert. But I also like think that there's something really exciting about diving into something that you're not an expert in and educating yourself and kind of like forcing yourself to learn something about something you don't know anything about. For me, that's very generative. It's like very, it makes me feel like there's like always like something, I don't know, it makes me feel like there's something unstable a little bit, that like, and it's very exciting for me, I guess, in that way.
Were there other, it could be like books or authors, or it could be, I don't know, music or movies or whatever, any other medium or things, I guess, that influenced you when you were writing Plat?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that was happening while I was writing House was I was living in Iowa City, and I was working for an art museum that did not have a building because it had been flooded like 10 years before. And so like all of the art collection was on loan. So we had offices but no museum. And so we would like do educational things in the community while they were trying to raise money for a new building. It was the most, like, one of the most bizarre kind of like work experiences I've ever had. Because it was so weird to explain that to people. They did end up finishing the building. It's the Museum of Art that's on the campus of the University of Iowa. But while I was there, it was they were in the process of designing the building and raising funds for it. And so we would have architects come in and talk to us and the director and the community about their plans and about their visions, and they would like go over brick choices and like on the one hand they would go over these brick choices or like talk about like parking and stuff. And then on the other hand, like these architects would come in and have these very theoretical kind of like, we're thinking about volumes and spaces and these very kind of like academic-y almost and artistic almost ways of trying to describe what they were doing, that a lot of people on staff and in the community were like, sorry, you've lost me, I don't understand what you're talking about. But that tension between like the idealistic and the material in relation to architecture in particular was sort of funny to me, but also really exciting and kind of wild. And that was like part of the soup that I was swimming in while I was writing this. And I think also like I learned a lot. I didn't study visual art either formally, but working in a museum alongside people, like alongside curators and educators and people who really did know so much about the way not just to handle art, but also like ways to look at art, ways to think about it. That was also really interesting to me and productive. And again, it sort of gave me a little bit of a lexicon to borrow from, and it helped me think about like the different ways that our senses get trained. I think we take for granted sometimes that our senses are just what they are, but we can be trained to look at art in a particular way. We can be trained to smell something in a particular way. And so those questions were also really interesting to me at the time. And they still are.
Yeah. There's something like really consistent between what you're saying about architecture and I think also like the experience of writing poetry and have it be received by kind of like a wider audience, where you're saying that there is like this practical application for architecture, and there is somewhat a practical application of poetry, thinking about how poetry is taught, how people are taught to observe language via poetry, but also there are these wider visions of anything that exists. I mean, the same could be said about any medium, that it's a tool to teach and to like express these like larger visions. I think it's really interesting.
Absolutely.
Really quickly, I want to ask, or if you could talk a little bit about Not an Allegory, a little bit about your perfume and kind of the goals of that, and then we can end just talking about final projects or what you're working on next.
Sure. So Not an Allegory is a perfume that I collaborated with Ali Kiral, who's based out of Chicago. She's a perfumer. She runs her own brand called Parfat Parfum, and she has this really great line. And so we reached out to her about doing a perfume for the book, and it was actually Naomi's idea, and I loved that idea, and I was like, absolutely, let's do it. And I had worked with Ali before. I had taught a writing and scent class online, and she took it from me, and so we had like corresponded and talked a lot about some of these questions about language and perfume. And so she kind of like knew where I was coming from, I think, with this project, and so she was really excited. I don't think it was maybe you'll have to ask her, but my sense was it was not a normal custom perfume request. I think she tends to get like wedding perfumes and stuff. So it was really, really fun to work with her. And basically what she asked like some kind of basic questions that I think she would ask anyone about the perfume, like, are there any notes that you hate? Are there like, what are your ideas? Kind of like, where are you coming from with this? But then she had me send her a copy of the manuscript, and so so I kind of like pulled out some potential notes that like kind of could like, lines in the book that could correspond to perfume notes, and then she went through the book as well and read it, and she kind of had her own ideas about some things. Like she was really attracted to the idea of like dusty curtains or like a dusty desk drawer, and I was really excited about violets because violets are in the book a lot. She was also really excited about the coyote. There's a coyote figure that recurs throughout the book, and she was like, we could do something really interesting with like an animalic scent. So then we kind of corresponded back and forth. She sent me some sketches, and I would like send her feedback, and she would send me more. And the really funny thing about where we landed, we were like kind of iterating on this one idea for a while, and it was like not feeling quite right. And then one day she like sends me a pack, and she's like, we're working on this one, you know, like here's this new version, but also here's this other one that I've developed, and I think you might like it, and here, I'll just throw it in just to see. And it was like completely out of left field, totally different, and I immediately was like, this is it. Like, we don't even have to change anything. This is like exactly the right one. There was like one little tweak that we made. So it sort of was this, I don't know what she would say about like where that came from, but I loved the idea that it wasn't like, again, I'm not an expert. I like wanted to collaborate with her in a way that like she, you know, and I think she did, like where she could kind of bring her own artistic kind of perspective to the book, and her own, like I think of that perfume as a translation of the book, in that like it's not a way of reading the book that I probably would have ever been able to come up with, but she kind of brought her own reading to it through that perfume, and I love it. It's great.
Yeah, it's a really strange perfume. I think people are really enjoying it. We put it on at the office
all the time. We have our office sample.
Yeah. I guess this is kind of jumping around a little bit. How much time do we have?
We should probably end.
We'll wrap it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'll ask like one more question, and we can talk about forthcoming projects. Mia had kind of like gotten to this, but more book specific. I'm always curious to know from authors, like, who do you consider to be part of your authorial DNA? Like, whose work is inextricable from yours as a writer?
Yeah, I think I think Lynn Haginian is someone, especially if you read this particular book, that I was really, yeah, I know, I was really working under the influence of, and sort of like that kind of strain of language poetry, which is so beautiful to me and so strange, and I don't feel like I gravitate toward all language poetry, but I absolutely adore her work. I think someone like Etel Adnan, also rest in peace recently, has also been really important to me. Bernadette Mayer, all
also
these sort of
recently.
Yeah, that's true. And like Clarice Lispector, all these sort of like amazing like women prose writers who are always kind of flirting with poetry, and vice versa, like poets that are flirting with prose, and also thinking about long works, long forms. I think there's like a whole kind of like stable of those writers that, like, when I feel blocked or like when I don't really know where to go next, I will sometimes flip through their books and just like find a word, or kind of get into the rhythm of their sentences and kind of use that as a runway to get into my own work. And then on the other hand, there's Emily Dickinson, who is like the complete opposite in some ways, but I think there's something about her approach to, she has a really amazing approach to some of these kind of like mystical questions and questions about God and questions about the way, and like I guess discomforts with the way the world works, that are really lovely, really exciting to me, and also always grounded in questions of language and representation and the problems inherent in those things. And that I think she's probably like the influence that I've carried for the longest in that sense, where some of those questions and the way she thinks about those have been totally foundational to the way that I tend to think about my own writing.
Thank you.
Is there anything else yeah, any forthcoming projects you want to, shout out?
Yeah, I'm working on a book of hybrid essays about that are it's in some ways very different, in some ways building on some of the same concerns of Plat, where I'm thinking about land art and land use in the American West, and especially related to resource extraction, and my own family history. I have family history of miners throughout the West, and again, I think I'm still questioning, or still kind of like interested in the question of like why space is the way it is in the West, why and how that has sort of imprinted itself on my brain. And this project started around the same time that I first started working on House. So I think they're coming out of some of the some similar questions, even as they're like, I'm doing like research on mining methodology and like things like that are totally different. But yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Sounds amazing.
Great. I'm excited. We should hold up the book. We have it here.
Yep.
Plat came out the end of May, and bookstores around America.
Go get your copy. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pause the recording.
Thank you, guys.